A report by the International Institute for Strategic Studies shows 2024 recording one of the highest annual increases in government spending on arms in more than a decade. Global defense spending jumped by $2.46 trillion last year, or nearly 10%. That translates to a national average of almost 2% of GDP, up from 1.8% in 2023. The report drawing a link between the rise in spending and increasing geopolitical tension. The two largest spenders, that's the US and China, made up around half the total expenditure. Russia was the third largest military spender, with a rise of 41.9% to $145 billion. Following its invasion of Ukraine almost 3 years ago. Washington's defense budget has grown at a steady pace since 2019. Experts say the US is projected to rely on supplemental funding to boost a shortfall. And now that President Donald Trump is in the picture, concerns have surfaced amongst allies such as Ukraine and Israel that the American leader will slash funding to the military. China's defense budget making up 44% of total regional spending, despite significant increases in India and Japan. The report states most defense spending in China will be allocated to procurement, personnel and training as Beijing tries to improve its combat readiness to counter Taiwan and regional states in the South China Sea. Russia also hiking its spending, with expenditure rising by around 6.6%. Despite losses from the war, reports say Moscow has been able to replenish troop supplies. Last September, Russian President Vladimir Putin announced plans to increase its armed forces strength to about 1.5 million. Experts say further increases are expected this year for Russia and Ukraine, with Moscow spending around 7.5% of its GDP on military and Ukraine more than 15%. Let's go to Olly Barratt, who is at the IISS presentation in London. Olly, as we just heard, the war in Ukraine and China's multi-year military modernization, just some of the principal drivers of this rise in global spending on the military. Now, neither of these is going to abate likely in the next few months, certainly this year. Given that they will not, what are the challenges countries are going to be facing with their need to keep spending on security?
That's exactly right. And this weighty tome is always a weighty tome when released by the IISS, but particularly so this year. Given some of those geopolitical challenges and the greater military spending that you've been taking us through. Now, when it comes to China and its People's Liberation Army, let me take you through some of the key findings in regards to how it is spending its money. The report has found that China is, in its words, with regards to its armed forces, continuing to modernize under three specific themes: anti-corruption, reorganization, and reform. It talks about significant efforts to root out corruption. The report also believes that the president of China, Xi Jinping, has greater, closer oversight, it says, of China's armed forces. And it also talks about China's growing capabilities and the step forwards that it has been making in military hardware terms. It references new aircraft designs, which it says are breaking cover, the rollout of J-20 multi-role aircraft. It talks about a third aircraft carrier commencing sea trials, with a fourth, in its words, believed to be under construction. 2 new long-range fire support brigades have also been formed. So a major focus on China in this report, a major focus also on the Ukraine-Russia conflict. Ukraine has been suffering, according to the authors of this report, perhaps larger casualties than the international community has actually been aware of. But it also talks of Russia's difficulties with regards to some of its equipment in the ongoing conflict. It does, though, believe that the Russian economy up to now is just about standing pretty well firm. Military spending in Europe a key concern. It's inconsistent in different countries, but the authors of this report certainly believe that these challenges are likely to rise rather than necessarily wane in the years ahead.
Thanks, Olly Barratt, reporting live there from the presentation of this weighty and considered very much authoritative report on defense economies and military spending. Olivia Siong is standing by live for us as well in Beijing. Olivia, we just heard from Olly Barratt there. China's defense budget increasing some 7% last year. Now, that outpaces the regional average, but to put that into perspective, the global spending rise is 7.4%. So, in fact, China coming slightly below the global average. Even so, what does this spending, vague as it is, that figure, what does that say about where China sees itself in terms of developing its military for the current geopolitical climate?
Wei Su, this is really a reflection of China continuing its efforts to modernize its military, which has gathered steam under President Xi. Remember that he has set the goal of developing a world-class military by 2050. And we saw that internal challenges were addressed. We talked about the addressing of corruption in the PLA, with the highest profile being the removal of two former defense ministers. The IISS said that, however, even amid a wider corruption investigation in the armed forces, this is unlikely to have affected China's military capabilities, given that such investigations are being used as either to address issues with processes or as a political tool. And another reason for the increase in spending is really China's intensifying rivalry with the U.S. and its allies. The big question being whether China will recalibrate given the second Trump administration. The IISS, again, also noting that there is a lot happening in terms of China's maritime capabilities, including experimentation with uncrewed vessels amid increased activity in hotspot areas at sea. Today, China voicing opposition to two U.S. vessels sailing through the Taiwan Strait, the first since President Trump came into office. Beijing also conducting today what it says are routine patrols in the South China Sea, hitting out at the Philippines for trying to persuade other countries to conduct joint maritime drills in the disputed waters. But while Mr. Trump has not exactly been very explicit on his administration's stance on these hotspot topics or issues of tension, an analyst I spoke to said that China's overall calculations and military posture is unlikely to change. Have a listen.
The military posture part has been, looking at the ability to either deter the United States or to push it away from the supposed first island chain. So that is quite persistent. Now, where the calibrations come in, that would be more diplomatic, that might be more economic, but not so much the military side, which is supposed to be the insurance, right? You would use the military if all those other measures do not work.
Oh, thanks for that. Olivia Siong, they're reporting live from Beijing. And Dr. Collin Koh joins us now. He's Senior Fellow at the Institute of Defence and Strategic Studies at IISS. Dr. Koh, we just heard there the overall picture of this report from London, and then our Beijing correspondent Olivia laying out China needing to recalibrate possibly its military posture given a new administration in the White House. A lot of talk about the 7% figure. But defense spending is just one part of a very big picture in terms of assessing the posture of a country, assessing, I suppose, the level of threat that it may pose to other countries. The larger picture, if you could, on China before we move on. Where are we on China's multi-year move to modernize its military?
Yeah, thank you, Wei Su, for this question. For the PLA, the modernization effort has been ongoing for decades, especially after the 1980s. The first phase had been largely on hardware and software, what they mentioned as informationized warfare. That was a capability focus that the PLA was on in the earlier decades, and in the more recent decades, there had been greater focus on the much more what some will call mundane organizational reforms, the restructuring of the force echelons at various levels. However, I think what we are seeing now is, of course, with the persistent focus on defense spending by China, notwithstanding its economic problems right now, the issue here is PLA is undertaking some lessons from the ongoing war in Ukraine. The background context of that was important because prior to that, of course, if given a choice, the PLA would prefer to learn from the best. And the PLA has always been the US military, but military exchanges between the two have been pretty minimal. And with Trump first administration, this has dropped to unprecedented low.
Dr. Koh, pardon me for cutting in.
Case study.
You mentioned Ukraine, increasingly close links between China and Russia on dual-use technology. So are there any lessons from the Ukraine war that China is drawing, and not just China, but every other country that, like Ukraine, or territory like Ukraine, looking at someone else that is far more powerful than yourself? So when you spend, you want maximum bang for your buck on military spending. What sort of lessons are we looking at?
That's a good one. Thanks so much. It is more than just about the technology. I think there are much more other lessons that the PLA is drawing from the current war in Ukraine, and that, of course, pertain to the force structure itself, how it could be able to undertake highly complex, integrated military operations, and, of course, the prospect of a conflict that may not be short and decisive and could potentially prolong. And, of course, much more pertinently, is the use of emerging technologies these days. Of course, unmanned systems, long-range systems, and with that, tying into the much broader military logistics concerns that were observed in the war in Ukraine. So there has been a lot of lessons that the PLA is drawing from the current conflict, ranging from emerging technology to logistics management, and of course, access to critical material that could sustain a war machine for protracted conflict.
All right, and we look at the principal players itself, not those who are drawing lessons, but Ukraine and Russia. It's been a war of attrition for both sides. Let's not forget, the original expectation was for Russia to essentially storm into Kyiv and take the government. Now it started in 2022, so we're close to the 3-year mark on what's happening in Ukraine. It hasn't ended. Both sides seeking to gain as much advantage on the battlefield before they're forced to any kind of negotiation. With Mr. Trump in the White House, the man who calls himself the man who can make a deal when no one else can, if you could very quickly weigh for us battlefield advantages, diplomatic advantages, if Russia and Ukraine and the US and the EU were to go for a deal right now, who is likely to win? Final question.
Yeah, this is a very good question, Wei Su. Prior to Trump entering the picture, the Russians appeared to be on the upper hand, given the advantages that it was accumulating on the battlefield, learning from the earlier lessons in its campaign with Ukraine. Its military was actually adapting to the losses, and of course, with the help from North Korea, Iran, it was able to sustain the losses and to push on and to claw back the territory that were taken by Ukraine in Kursk, for example. The reason why Kursk was important, as was reported, was it was meant to be a bargaining chip for Kiev when it comes to the subsequent negotiations for peace. Given that sort of conundrum, it would have been disadvantageous for Ukraine to enter into a negotiation without any face-saving measure. But now with Trump into the picture, it does appear that while Ukraine is suffering reversals on the battlefield, but on the strategic diplomatic front, it appears that Trump has added in some new complication. For example, imposing sanctions, and of course, his call to the OPEC to reduce global oil prices in the bid to try to disable Russia's means to sustain the war in Ukraine. So going forward, we are also looking at Trump proceeding with the ongoing arms supplies to Ukraine, and there was clear signals that Trump has rolled back on the earlier rhetoric to end the war in 24 hours. And now the administration appears to be settling on a more realistic time frame. So in the months ahead, we're likely going to see more moves on the diplomatic front. By the same time, we're going to see the sort of seesawing developments ongoing on the battlefield between Russia and Ukraine, especially on the Eastern Front. And of course, now Kursk has entered into a new situation, not just with North Korea, but also with last week, the reported new offensive that was undertaken by Ukraine.
All right, two fronts, both diplomatic and on the battlefield. And there was quoting from the IISS report, both sides suffering high attrition rates. Dr. Collin Koh, there, Senior Fellow at the Institute of Defence and Strategic Studies at IISS.